Hello, and welcome to Invisible Histories, a podcast that explores untold and overlooked stories from Southeast Asia. I'm your host, Vivian-Final, and in today's episode, I'm sharing my final research project for Cultures of Southeast Asia. This topic is deeply personal to me as it focuses on the history, displacement, and resilience of the Hmong people, especially in Laos and Vietnam. And as a Hmong daughter born in the United States, I've spent years trying to piece together the hidden parts of my family's past. And through this podcast, I want to bring voice to those histories that have been erased or forgotten. And I argue that the history of the Hmong, particularly during and after the Secret War in Laos, has been systematically erased from dominant narratives in Southeast Asia and even in the United States. Yet through migration, storytelling, and spiritual tradition, the Hmong have carried their identity forward. And this podcast combines research, lived experience, and cultural memory to reclaim a place for Hmong voices in the histories of the region. So to start off with our first segment of this episode, we'll begin with colonial legacy and erasure. So to understand this erasure, we need to go back to the colonial period. So during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, France colonized Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and the Hmong who had long lived in highland regions were viewed as outsiders, like non-Buddhist, non-urban, and non-conforming to the systems colonial governments preferred. And French authorities grouped indigenous ethnic minorities like the Hmong under the term Mononards or mountain people and often labeled them as, quote, primitive or unmodern. And while the French used Hmong labor and at times formed alliances with them, the Hmong were excluded from governance and education systems. And this historical marginalization laid the foundation for how the Hmong would continue to be treated as useful but disposable. And when the French left in the 1950s, newly independent governments in Laos and Vietnam inherited these systems of exclusion. And moving on to segment two, the Secret War and Hmong displacement, the Cold War brought even more disruption in what became known as the Secret War. The United States CIA recruited over 30,000 Hmong men to fight against communist forces in Laos, and this war was hidden from the public and even from Congress. And Hmong soldiers fought bravely alongside American interests, but when the U.S. pulled out in 1975, the Hmong were abandoned. The Pathet Lao government viewed them as traitors and thousands were killed, while others fled to the jungles trying to survive. And eventually, Hmong families, including mine, escaped to refugee camps in Thailand, and from there were resettled in the United States and other countries. However, the trauma of that war is still alive, and to this day, there are Hmong people hiding in the jungles of Laos, too afraid to come forward. And in U.S. classrooms, this war is barely mentioned. And so, growing up in the U.S., I didn't learn about the Secret War in school. I learned about it in bits and pieces from my family. And so I didn't understand why so many elders were quiet or why certain topics were avoided. And it wasn't until I started asking questions and eventually taking classes like this one that the larger picture began to come together. So moving on to segment three of cultural memory and personal telling, to despite all of this trauma and displacement, the Hmong have survived through cultural resilience. And much of our history is not written in books, but it's preserved through rituals, ceremonies, and oral storytelling. And in my own life, I didn't truly begin connecting to Hmong traditions until I was around 10 years old. I witnessed my first soul calling ceremony led by a shaman. And to be honest, it was both mysterious and powerful. And, we were told what not to do and how to respect the ritual and how to understand the balance between the physical and spiritual worlds. And at the age 13, I attended my first Hmong funeral. And it was another deep cultural experience that was filled with sacred music that guides the spirits to the afterlife. And at 15, I participated in the Hmong New Year, where young people are introduced into the community and even meet potential suitors. And honestly, it felt like my own version of Bridgerton. And at 18, I was spiritually uplifted during a ritual and told that I had been chosen to become a shaman healer. And at that moment, it connected me not only to my ancestors, but to a lineage of spiritual responsibility. And at 20, I experienced my first monk wedding, and it made me realize how, in Hmong tradition, once a daughter marries, she leaves her family and joins her husband's clan. And this transition is more symbolic than like it's spiritual, cultural, and generational. And so these experiences helped me realize that even if we live far from Laos or Vietnam, our stories are still alive. We hold them in the ceremonies we perform, the names we carry, and the songs we sing, and the silence we break by speaking. And to close off this segment, I just want to conclude that this project taught me that history is not just what's in the textbooks, but it's also what we carry in our bodies, our memories, and our communities. And the Hmong are not just refugees or forgotten allies. We are people of deep culture, language, and resilience. And by reclaiming our stories through podcasts, through rituals, through personal testimony, we resist historical erasure and we refuse to be silent. And so sharing these experiences isn't just about educating others, it's about affirming who we are. And the Hmong journey across Southeast Asia is one of survival, but also one of strength. And now, as a new generation steps forward, we carry these histories, not as burdens, but as honor. But thank you for listening to Invisible Histories. I hope this episode helped bring a little more light to a story that deserves to be heard.